One microscopic bacterium killed more people than many of history's greatest wars combined. It did not command an army. It did not conquer kingdoms. Yet within a few years, it transformed economies, overthrew social systems, reshaped religions, accelerated scientific thinking, and permanently altered the course of human civilization. The Black Death was far more than a medieval disease. It was one of the greatest turning points in history. But perhaps the most surprising part is this. The pandemic that devastated Europe did not begin there. It emerged from a world that had become more connected than ever before. The same trade networks that carried prosperity across continents also carried catastrophe. To understand the Black Death is to understand both the power and the danger of globalization itself. For centuries before the Black Death, Eurasia was becoming increasingly interconnected. Merchants traveled between China, Central Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and Europe through an expanding web of overland and maritime trade routes. Silk, spices, porcelain, silver, textiles, horses, and precious stones crossed deserts, mountains, and seas. But trade carried far more than valuable goods. It carried information, ideas, religions, technologies, and sometimes invisible biological passengers. By the early 14th century, this interconnected world had reached an unprecedented level of integration. Much of Eurasia had experienced a period historians often call the Pax Mongolica. Although the Mongol Empire eventually fragmented into separate khanates, the political stability created across vast regions of Asia made long-distance travel safer than it had been for generations. Merchants moved more frequently. Diplomats traveled farther. Pilgrims crossed continents. Communication accelerated. Ironically, the same conditions that encouraged prosperity also created ideal pathways for infectious diseases. History had entered an era in which local outbreaks could become continental disasters. The disease responsible for the Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Modern genetic research strongly supports this conclusion, although medieval people had no understanding of bacteria or microbes. Scientists continue studying the precise ecological origins of the pandemic. Current evidence suggests that natural reservoirs of plague existed among wild rodents in parts of Central Asia and neighboring regions. From there, the bacterium periodically spread into flea populations. When infected fleas fed on rats or occasionally other mammals, they transmitted the disease. As trade expanded, black rats increasingly traveled aboard ships and within commercial supply chains. The fleas came with them. What began as a localized ecological relationship eventually became an international biological crisis. No one intended to transport the plague, yet every caravan, every merchant vessel, and every warehouse became a potential link in an invisible chain of transmission. The world's first era of globalization had created an unexpected vulnerability. Although historians debate the exact route taken by the pandemic, one widely accepted sequence begins somewhere in Inner or Central Asia before the disease spread westward through commercial networks. By the mid-1440s, plague had reached trading centers around the Black Sea. One of the most famous episodes occurred during the siege of the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in 1346. Contemporary accounts describe plague devastating the besieging Mongol forces, and some later chroniclers claimed infected corpses were launched over the city's walls. Whether this specific event significantly contributed to transmission remains debated among historians. What is well supported is that merchants fleeing the region carried the disease aboard ships into the Mediterranean. From there, the pandemic spread with astonishing speed. Ports became gateways. Trade routes became highways for infection. Within only a few years, much of Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East faced one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history.
In October 1347, ships arriving in the Sicilian port of Messina brought more than cargo. Many sailors were already gravely ill. Others died shortly after reaching shore. Witnesses described fever, weakness, painful swellings known today as buboes, and rapid death. Authorities attempted to expel some of the arriving ships, but by then it was already too late. The disease had entered Europe. During the following months, plague spread relentlessly across the Mediterranean. Trade ports connected distant regions with extraordinary efficiency. Unfortunately, the pathogen benefited from that same efficiency. By 1348, plague reached France, England, the Iberian Peninsula, the Holy Roman Empire, the Low Countries, Scandinavia. Entire communities watched the disease arrive with terrifying predictability. One traveler became ill, then a family, then a neighborhood, then an entire town. No one understood why. Without knowledge of bacteria, vectors, or epidemiology, medieval physicians struggled to explain what they witnessed. Some blamed poisonous air. Others believed unusual planetary alignments had corrupted the atmosphere. Many interpreted the disaster as divine punishment. None of these explanations could stop its advance. The human toll was extraordinary. Modern estimates vary because medieval records remain incomplete. Most historians conclude that the Black Death killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population between 1347 and approximately 1352. Some local communities experienced even higher mortality. Entire villages disappeared. Monasteries lost most of their members. Families vanished within days. Cities emptied. Church bells rang almost continuously. Grave diggers themselves often became victims. Traditional burial practices collapsed under the overwhelming number of deaths. Mass graves became increasingly common. The psychological impact proved almost as devastating as the disease itself. Daily life lost its predictability. Parents feared their children. Neighbors avoided one another. Commerce slowed. Fields remained unharvested. Markets closed. Normal routines disintegrated. For many people, it seemed as though the world itself was ending. Yet the plague did not affect everyone equally. Some regions experienced repeated outbreaks. Others suffered comparatively lower mortality. Geography mattered. Population density mattered. Climate, local ecology, sanitation, trade connections, and simple chance all influenced outcomes. The disease itself also appeared in different clinical forms. The bubonic form, spread primarily through infected flea bites, caused swollen lymph nodes. Pneumonic plague infected the lungs and could spread directly between people through respiratory droplets, making it especially dangerous. Septicemic plague entered the bloodstream and often proved rapidly fatal. These different manifestations complicated medieval observations. To contemporaries, it appeared as though the disease constantly changed its behavior. Modern microbiology provides clearer explanations, but uncertainty still exists regarding the precise balance between transmission pathways during different outbreaks. Fear transformed society almost as quickly as the disease. Cities introduced some of history's earliest organized public health measures. Travel restrictions appeared. Markets closed. Ships were ordered to remain offshore before passengers could disembark. From these practices emerged one of the world's most enduring public health concepts: quarantine. The word itself derives from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days. Authorities in maritime cities required arriving ships from infected areas to remain isolated before entering port. Although medieval officials did not understand bacteria, they recognized through experience that limiting contact sometimes reduced transmission. Observation preceded scientific explanation. It was an early example of empirical public health. Fear also produced darker consequences. Throughout Europe, rumors spread rapidly. In the absence of scientific understanding, many communities searched desperately for someone to blame. Minority groups, including Jewish communities in numerous regions, were falsely accused of causing the plague, leading to horrific persecutions, expulsions, and massacres, despite the complete absence of evidence. These tragedies illustrate a recurring historical pattern. During periods of uncertainty, fear often seeks simple explanations. Scapegoating rarely solves crises. Instead, it creates new ones. The Black Death reminds us that pandemics spread disease, but misinformation and prejudice can spread alongside them. As mortality continued rising, Europe's economy entered a profound crisis. Labor disappeared almost overnight. Fields lacked workers. Construction projects halted. Skilled craftsmen became scarce. The balance between landowners and laborers began to shifting in unexpected ways. For centuries, much of medieval Europe's economy had depended on abundant agricultural labor. Now, labor had become one of society's rarest resources. Survivors suddenly possessed bargaining power their parents scarcely could imagine. Landlords competed for workers. Wages rose in many regions despite official attempts to prevent them. Governments introduced laws freezing wages or restricting worker mobility. Many proved difficult to enforce. The demographic catastrophe had fundamentally altered the economics of labor. For millions of ordinary people, tragedy unintentionally created new opportunities. The old social order was beginning to crack. The plague, therefore, became much more than a health crisis. It evolved into a catalyst for structural transformation. Feudal relationships weakened in many parts of Europe. Urban economies gradually expanded. Mechanization became increasingly attractive where workers were scarce. Land use changed as abandoned farmland returned to forests or shifted towards less labor-intensive activities such as livestock grazing. Economic adaptation followed demographic collapse. The Black Death did not single-handedly end medieval society, but it accelerated processes that were already underway. History rarely changes because of one cause alone. Instead, major events often amplify deeper trends already present beneath the surface. The Black Death was one of history's greatest accelerators. It forced societies to adapt or disappear.
The Black Death is often remembered as a medical catastrophe, but its greatest historical significance lies in the systems it transformed. Pandemics are not simply biological events. They expose the strengths and weaknesses of the societies they strike. The plague spread because 4 separate systems had become deeply interconnected. The first was ecology. Yersinia pestis existed in wild rodent populations long before humans became its primary victims. On its own, the bacterium remained part of a relatively stable natural cycle. Human expansion into new environments, increasing trade, and closer contact with animal populations created opportunities for that cycle to spill over into human societies. The second system was trade. The Black Death did not spread because medieval people were unusually unhealthy or unhygienic by the standards of their time. It spread because Eurasia had become connected. Merchants linked cities separated by thousands of kilometers. Ships crossed the Mediterranean continuously. Caravans crossed Central Asia. Every successful commercial connection also became a potential pathway for disease. Globalization increased prosperity. It also increased systemic risk. The third system was urbanization. By the 14th century, many European cities had grown significantly. Narrow streets, crowded housing, poor sanitation, stored food, and large rodent populations created ideal conditions for plague transmission once the disease arrived. Density amplified infection. Cities that had become engines of commerce also became engines of contagion. The fourth system was knowledge, or rather the limits of knowledge. Medieval physicians possessed impressive observational skills for their era, but they lacked microbiology, germ theory, antibiotics, and modern epidemiology. Many treatments were based on the dominant medical theories of the time, including balancing bodily humors or purifying supposedly corrupted air. Some interventions were ineffective. Others may even have worsened outcomes. This was not because medieval scholars lacked intelligence. They lacked the scientific tools that later generations would develop. The Black Death illustrates an enduring principle. A society's ability to respond to crisis depends not only on its resources, but also on its understanding. The pandemic also transformed Europe's economy in ways that reached far beyond the immediate death toll. For centuries before the plague, population growth had placed increasing pressure on agricultural land. In many regions, labor was abundant, while land was relatively scarce. This imbalance strengthened the position of large landowners. The Black Death abruptly reversed that relationship. When millions died, labor became scarce. Workers could negotiate better wages. Peasants gained greater mobility. Landowners struggled to maintain previous obligations. Although the process differed from region to region, the demographic collapse weakened many traditional feudal structures. This transformation was neither immediate nor universal. Eastern Europe, for example, often experienced different developments than Western Europe, with some regions reinforcing forms of serfdom rather than weakening them. History rarely follows a single path. Yet, across much of Western Europe, the plague contributed to a gradual redistribution of economic power. Scarcity altered incentives. In many areas, innovation became increasingly valuable because replacing lost workers through technology or improved organization became more attractive than relying solely on human labor. Economic historians continued debating exactly how much the Black Death accelerated later developments such as mechanization, commercialization, and the transition towards early capitalism. There is no single consensus explaining every region, but most agree that the pandemic fundamentally reshaped Europe's long-term economic trajectory. The plague also transformed institutions. Governments gradually recognized that disease could threaten political stability as much as foreign invasion. Italian city-states pioneered increasingly sophisticated public health measures. Permanent health boards emerged. Officials monitored outbreaks. Travel restrictions became more organized. Records improved. These institutions represented an important shift. States began treating public health as a matter of governance rather than purely private or religious concern. Centuries later, these administrative traditions would contribute to modern epidemiology, disease surveillance, and national public health systems. The Black Death therefore helped redefine the relationship between governments and public welfare. Religion experienced profound changes as well. For many medieval Europeans, faith provided comfort during unimaginable suffering. Churches cared for the sick, buried the dead, and supported survivors. Many clergy died while performing these duties. At the same time, the scale of the catastrophe challenged deeply held assumptions. If God protected the faithful, why were entire monasteries devastated? Why did children die alongside priests? Why did prayer appear unable to halt the disease? Different communities reached different conclusions. Some experienced renewed religious devotion, others became increasingly skeptical of established authorities. Historians caution against attributing later movements, such as the Protestant Reformation, directly to the Black Death. The connections are indirect and unfolded over centuries. Nevertheless, the pandemic contributed to broader shifts in social and religious attitudes by exposing the limits of existing institutions. The cultural impact proved equally enduring. Artists increasingly portrayed death not as a distant abstraction, but as an unavoidable companion to everyday life. The motif, known as the danse macabre, the dance of death, depicted skeletons leading kings, merchants, peasants, and clergy alike towards the grave. Its message was unmistakable. Death spared no social class. Literature, visual art, and public memory absorbed the trauma of the pandemic. Generations that survived carried its psychological imprint long after the outbreak subsided. Civilizations remember catastrophes not only through statistics, but through stories.
Comparing the Black Death with modern pandemics reveals both dramatic differences and striking similarities. The 14th century lacked microscopes, antibiotics, intensive care units, genetic sequencing, and global health organizations. Modern societies possess scientific capabilities medieval physicians could scarcely imagine. Researchers can identify pathogens within days. Vaccines can sometimes be developed within months. International laboratories share genetic data almost instantly. Medical technology has transformed humanity's defensive capabilities. Yet biology is only part of the story. Many of the social dynamics remain surprisingly familiar. During both medieval and modern pandemics, trade networks accelerated transmission. Governments struggled to balance public health with economic activity. Rumors spread alongside disease. Communities debated restrictions. Scientists revised recommendations as new evidence emerged. The details differed. The underlying challenges often echoed one another. The Black Death reminds us that pandemics are never purely medical events. They become political, economic, psychological, and cultural crises simultaneously. Understanding disease, therefore, requires understanding society itself. Despite centuries of research, historians and scientists continue investigating important questions about the Black Death. One major area of debate concerns its precise origins. Genetic studies strongly support Central Asia as an important source of the pandemic lineage, and recent archaeological and genomic research has narrowed the likely region. However, the exact sequence of events leading from animal reservoirs to continental transmission remains under investigation. Scholars also continue examining how the disease spread. For much of the 20th century, the dominant explanation emphasized fleas carried by black rats. Today, many researchers argue that transmission was more complex. Human fleas, body lice, direct respiratory transmission during pneumonic outbreaks, environmental conditions, and multiple animal hosts may all have contributed under different circumstances. Rather than replacing earlier explanations, current scholarship increasingly favors a combination of transmission pathways that varied by location and time. Mortality estimates also remain uncertain. Because medieval censuses were incomplete and many records disappeared, historians rely on tax documents, church records, archaeological evidence, wills, and other indirect sources. Most estimates suggest that between 30% and 50% of Europe's population died during the initial pandemic, but exact figures inevitably vary by region. Recognizing uncertainty is essential. History is strongest when it acknowledges the limits of available evidence rather than pretending complete certainty where none exists. The Black Death belongs to the 14th century. Its lessons belong to every century. The pandemic demonstrated that connectivity creates both opportunity and vulnerability. Today's world is vastly more interconnected than medieval Eurasia. Commercial aircraft cross continents in hours rather than months. Global supply chains link factories on different continents. Digital communication allows information and misinformation to spread almost instantly. This interconnectedness has produced extraordinary prosperity. It has also increased the speed at which crises can become global. The Black Death teaches that resilience matters as much as efficiency. Highly optimized systems often perform exceptionally well under normal conditions, but unexpected shocks expose hidden weaknesses.
Modern governments invest in disease surveillance, international scientific cooperation, emergency planning, and public health infrastructure, partly because history has repeatedly shown the cost of unpreparedness. The pandemic also reminds us of another enduring lesson. Science is cumulative. The physicians of the 14th century worked with the best knowledge available to them. Future generations expanded that knowledge through observation, experimentation, and evidence. Every major advance in microbiology, epidemiology, sanitation, and medicine represents humanity learning from earlier tragedies. Finally, the Black Death challenges a common misconception about history. Civilizations are not transformed only by conquerors, inventors, or political leaders. Sometimes, microscopic organisms alter history more profoundly than emperors. Understanding that reality encourages humility. Human societies possess remarkable power, but they remain deeply connected to the biological world they inhabit.
The Black Death was not simply a chapter in medieval history. It was a turning point that revealed how deeply connected humanity had already become. A bacterium, invisible to the naked eye, crossed continents using the same networks that carried commerce, culture, and innovation. In doing so, it reshaped economies, challenged institutions, transformed social structures, and changed the direction of history. The pandemic reminds us that every interconnected civilization faces a fundamental paradox. The connections that make societies stronger can also make them more vulnerable. Trade creates prosperity. Movement spreads ideas. Communication accelerates progress. But those same networks can carry crises with equal speed. Perhaps that is the Black Death's greatest lesson. History is not only shaped by human ambition, it is also shaped by humanity's relationship with the natural world, and by our ability to understand, adapt, and cooperate when that relationship is tested. What future challenges might reveal about our own interconnected world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more explorations into the events that reshaped human history.